Good morning, everyone. My name is Christoph Mergerson, and I'm an assistant professor of race and media here at the Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. We are joined today by three extraordinary journalists who are going to talk about their experiences in business and economic journalism, how they came to that career path, and some of the wonderful work that they've been involved in producing. And at the end of this session, we're going to have a period for some Q&A. So we're joined by Kimberly Johnson, who is the Deputy Chief News Editor at the Wall Street Journal, Tracy Jan, who is the Deputy Health and Science Editor at the Washington Post, and by Andrea McDaniels, who is the Managing Editor at the Baltimore Banner. So we have commercial and nonprofit journalism in the house, New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., all love with the I-95 corridor. And also want to thank the students and other guests who have joined us this morning. I noticed several of my students past and present here, so I'd like to think I was a good influence. But let's turn the panel to our stars, because it's about them. So let's start with Kimberly. And this general set of questions that I want to ask each of you have to do with your professional backgrounds and how you came to cover business and economic news, because I think that understanding that career progression would be very helpful for many of the students who are in our audience. So, Kimberly, you were the lead editor for the journal's 2021 series on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, which explored the financial repercussions of the massacre on black communities in Tulsa and its connections to the wealth gap in America. And we'll get to that shortly, but my question for you is, my first question is, how did you arrive at a career in business journalism? Is that something you always knew you wanted to do, or did you have some experiences in college that led you to that direction?
Great. Thank you, and it's nice to be here. And so I did have a number of experiences in college that ended up leading me, I'd like to say at the time, begrudgingly to business journalism. So I went to Boston University.
I'm sorry, Kimberly, could you use the microphone just so we can, the recording can pick you up?
It's unclear, okay.
We'll make sure they're on, yeah. There we go.
Oh, that's
there we go.
Okay.
Thanks, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem.
You were saying.
So, yes, I did have a number of experiences in college that led me to business journalism. I went to Boston University, their college communication there, and majored in broadcast journalism. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I was interested in telling a variety of stories, really around the black community, and really focused on African American history and things of that nature. I ended up being the business editor of the student newspaper. We started a business section. I was the first business editor there. My first internship was at a magazine called CFO Magazine, focused on chief financial officers. I did a lot of things in technology. The web, I'm so old that the web was relatively new then. So I did a lot of tech and programming and things. So I had a variety of interests. And I did a semester abroad in London because I really just wanted to have a number of different experiences in college. And the internship placement there was at CNN International. Everyone wanted to work at the BBC, and then we all got to London and they said, well, none of you are going to work at the BBC. So CNN is sort of the next level down. But nonetheless, it was a great experience, and it was CNN's International's daily business news show. And they were covering all of these things, from trading floors and mad cow disease, and they had to pull beef off of the shelves, and we were going around to all of these offices, and it was a little mind-buzzing. I somewhat understood what was going on, but I really didn't. I just sort of did what they told me to do. And I was graduating after the internship, and they said, well, you can go get a job at CNN in New York. And I said, well, maybe, maybe not. And so I ended up getting a job at CNN in New York. And that was also, CNN also had a financial news channel, CNN FN. It's not around anymore. And so I started working there, and it was sort of like these data points every 45 minutes for headline news. Like looking at stock numbers, like getting stock prices, figuring out, like getting unemployment numbers, looking at bond prices, and I just had no idea what I was doing. And the producer there gave me this book, and it was the Wall Street Journal's Guide to Business and Investing. So I'd read that on the train in New York going back and forth. And I still didn't really understand what was going on. But everyone was having a great time. They were all into it. Everyone was gainfully employed. And it was growing. And I said, well, there could be something here, but I need to understand more. And my plans were to go back to grad school and become like a African-American scholar like Cornell West or Henry Louis Gates or something, and apply that to journalism somehow. I really had no idea what I wanted to do. They're really poorly laid out plans. So the day that CNN said, oh, we want to make your freelance situation permanent, I said, well, that's great. I quit. I'm going back to grad school. Again, a series of really bad decisions early on in my career. So I went back to grad school, and then I realized I went back to Boston University, and they had a business and economics journalism program. And so the first week, I changed my major in grad school from print journalism and African American studies to business and economics journalism. It was an extra semester, but given what I'd seen that past 6 months at CNN, and how much work everyone did and how active the response was, it definitely seemed like a fantastic opportunity. And that it was. I've been employed ever since, so probably 27, 28 years now, and pretty much always in business journalism. Even when I did not want jobs in business journalism, they seemed to find me. So, from Boston to New Haven as a business reporter, to the Denver Post as a business reporter covering technology and biotech, to the Associated Press covering the auto industry, to West Africa, covering financial activity in places like Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, where I lived, and to the Wall Street Journal for the past 8 years. And there have been a number of experiences along the way that I believe I would have never received had I not made those decisions early on. So that was a very long-winded.
No, that's great. I love that type of detail for our students to hear. I wrote this down for the next faculty mentor meeting. Become the Henry Louis Gates of journalism. I think that's an awesome ambition. I love that.
It did not happen.
I mean, that's a pretty high bar. So, was a follow-up question for you, Kimberly? Was there a particular journalist to whom you looked up to during this formative period in your career, or someone whom you said, yeah, that's the person whose career and whose professional style I want to emulate?
No, I think that's really hard because there are not a lot of business journalists. There are not necessarily a lot of business journalists who look like me.
Mm-hmm.
So that was hard. When I got to the Journal, I saw Connie there. That was very exciting. So that made me feel a lot better. No, not necessarily. There are people's work who I admire. There's editors along the way that I had at the AP that I stayed in touch with. So I just sort of had to find my own path.
And now you're someone to whom we should look up to. So that worked out pretty well. Yeah, it's funny how those things. It's great. Tracy. So you're currently, of course, the Deputy Health and Science Editor at the Washington Post. And I don't know, does that include overseeing the Capitol Weather Gang? Because that's like my favorite section of any media. Shout out the Capitol Weather Gang. Yeah, no, everyone loves them. I definitely do. Shout out Jason, shout out Ian, shout out Matthew Capucci. I love that. But turning the focus back on you where it belongs, you actually launched the race and economy beat for the Post in 2016, and you did that for 6 years, focused on reparations and systemic racism, and racial and ethnic disparities and health and economic outcomes during the pandemic. Boy, I have questions about that. So how did the race and economic beat come about at the Post? Like, what was the motivation to create that? How did you get involved with it?
Thank you for asking. I don't know. Can you guys hear me? Because this is not. Am I supposed to see me working? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We'll freelance it. Yeah, we can go.
So I'm here as a former reporter who, even hearing just the inspiring opening today, I'm like, damn, I want my old job back. I'm an editor is definitely not as much fun as being a reporter, shaping the coverage telling the stories you feel like need to be told. So I came to the Washington Post from the Boston Globe. Previously, I was a national political reporter covering the 2016 and 2012 presidential campaigns. And when I heard the Post was creating this intersection of race and the economy beat, I was thinking, that is my dream beat. I was already in Washington for the Globe, and I went over to the Post and had a bunch of interviews, including from Marty Barron, who used to be the editor of the Boston Globe. And I remember he asked tough questions, and he's like, so why would a political reporter, a lot of people are in DC, they think political reporting is like the pinnacle of journalism, right? A lot of people feel that way. I did not feel that way. He's like, why would you want to do this beat? And I said, I want to create something. I have there's a ton of stories that need to be told that are not being told. I want to be the ones that tell them. And in my entire career, whether I was covering education at the Oregonian or education at the Boston Globe or health at the Boston Globe or national politics, I was interested in race and justice stories, inequality, class, all sorts of intersectional type of stories. And I was still skeptical. I'm like, why would the Post create this beat? I just felt like it was too good to be true. And I was thinking, when I first started in December 2016 after the Trump campaign, which I covered, I was thinking, and the beat was created before Trump won. Like, I knew I was going to the Washington Post to do this beat. But after the election, I just felt like there was even a greater urgency for my presence there. A type of beat like that was so rare, I wasn't sure how long it would last. So I busted my ass to make sure my work had an impact quickly and frequently, so that there was a reason to preserve this beat. And I'm fortunate that I had it for 6 years before I decided to transition to editing just this past May. My approach to the beat was, again, telling stories that I felt like only I was positioned to tell. It's a huge beat. It could be anything. And first of all, I have to say, I'm a fake business reporter. I did not have any training in the markets. I dropped econ in college because it met every day at 8 a.m. But I read a lot, and I'm surrounded by a lot of smart people and colleagues, and so I ask a lot of questions. And my beat was based on the financial desk at the Washington Post, but people from outside the Post, they don't really know the distinction between financial or national or local. It's just you tell good stories. So I felt like a lot of my stories, I tried to have some sort of accountability angle to it, as well as explanatory. And I remember during 2020, in the middle of COVID, everyone was working from home. George Floyd had just been murdered. My colleagues and I were leading a panel at the Post about this race coverage. And the managing editor asked us whether we felt like we needed to focus more on accountability reporting, whether these types of stories would be more effectively told as through the accountability lens or an explanatory lens. And all of us said both. You have to have both. These stories need to have historical context, they need to have cultural context, and for why it matters. All of these racial, economic, injustice stories have some sort of accountability lens. There are people and institutions to be held to account for why things are the way they are, and there are systemic problems in this country that it's our jobs to highlight. I don't want to go on too much.
No. There's a good context, and the powers that be have just whispered in my ear that the mic should be working now. You just need to hold them a little bit closer to pick them up for the recording. So
okay.
That's what I'm told, allegedly.
Okay.
We love our tech crew. I'm joking. They work very hard for us. So Tracy, this next question, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on it, although one could argue it's an unfair question that I should have perhaps the publisher and the editor in this front seat saying, why hasn't this happened? But I'm really interested to hear your perspective. Why did the Washington Post not formally have a race and economic beat until 2016? And I mean, in fairness, I'm sure there are reporters that were doing this kind of work, doing these stories, but what was changing inside of the Post to where we come to 2016 and they say now's the time to establish this kind of beat?
That's an excellent question. Is this working?
I'm told it is.
Okay.
Allegedly, yeah.
I think that most outlets did not have such a beat. And I think most people did not create such beats until 2020. However, looking back, I've been around for a long time, including from when the internet was first launched. Well, when the World Wide Web became a big thing in the late 90s, there were race teams around the country. It was like the trending thing in the 90s, right? The New York Times had a whole race series. They wrote a whole book, a bunch of Mercury News, my old paper at the Oregonian, we all had race reporters. But the intersection of race and the economy is like a very specific thing. I know that there is different feelings about having race beats. There is a feeling that you are ghettoizing that type of coverage if you pin it on one person or one team. I felt like obviously I was not the only reporter covering race at the Washington Post, thankfully, because it is a value that many editors and reporters really, really feel strongly about at the Post. And that coverage continues whether or not it's like a technical beat. That beat has not been filled since I left it. I've been told it will be filled. It'll be under the accountability editor, the new accountability editor on the financial desk. So I'm very happy about that. Hopefully that'll happen in the next year. After George Floyd's murder, the Post and a bunch of other news outlets did create similar types of beats to mine, but they were embedded in different desks. So the health team has a health equity reporter. There are a couple of race and culture reporters on the America desk. There's people covering politics and race. There was a feature writer who was focused on race, who has left us. So there are different variations of this. And part of me, like, it doesn't matter almost. It matters institutionally to have leadership that cares about this stuff. But if you're a reporter who cares about it, it doesn't matter what your beat is. Just do the stories. Like, I was doing these stories as an education reporter, which is the best place, one of the best places, beats in the newsroom to just write about America, right? Everything happening now with trans rights and culture wars and Black history, it's all playing out in the classroom.
Awesome, thank you. Wonderful perspective. Andrea, good morning. So again, you're currently the managing editor at the Baltimore Banner. But before that, for several years, you were a business reporter at the Baltimore Sun. And before that, you were a race and immigration reporter at the Charlotte Observer. So my questions for you are, how did you start covering race and immigration issues at the Observer, and how did those influences and any other life experiences you've had influence your work as a business reporter for the site?
Sure. So is this on? No. No? Okay.
Yeah.
Now is it on?
No.
We tried.
It'll just hurt your thumb.
Yeah. Oh, I have to
Yeah.
hold it? Is that what it is? Is it on now? Oh, okay.
Okay.
No? I'm not loud, so actually need it on, but I will try.
We'll find out.
So I'll start with the business reporting. I never, ever intended to cover business reporting, had no interest, whatever. But like you said, it always kind of became part of the beat. When I started at the Charlotte Observer, by the way, I'm a J School grad, so I love the J School. And yes, 96, much older than you guys. But my first job was at the Charlotte Observer. I covered small town government, but I was covering a bedroom community of Charlotte, and there was lots of development going on. So that just ended up being a part of the beat. It's just, part of covering government, part of covering a town. I started covering race and immigration because I wanted to. I'm a Black woman. I see injustices. It's always been a part of my reporting. You cover discrimination. You cover injustices. Even when I was covering small town politics, I was in a town where the majority of the city council was Black, but they did not use their power. They listened to what the white mayor said. So race and justice is just, always a part of the story. And I wanted to cover race in Charlotte when I moved from the bureau to the main newsroom, because Charlotte was rapidly changing. There was a large Latino population moving in. Yet here you have this southern city where, there's Black and white issues, and then you throw in Latino issues, and it was just disrupting the city. So it was just an interest of mine, so that's how I fell into that. Covering business, honestly, I was trying to get back home. The Sun had a business job open. I applied. And it was a minority business job, so my interests in race, I guess, made me want to explore maybe covering business too. But I ended up covering business for more than a decade. The racial injustice issues, covered retail, covered manufacturing, covered marketing. Got to cover Under Armour from the ground up because nobody thought, everybody was like this little company. Nobody knew anything about it, but I was covering it from the ground up, from when it went public, from when it started in the basement. I still have the original press kit, which is like, you would laugh if you saw it. It's just like, printed out, printouts that you would do on your computer, to when they went public, to when, they introduced a sneaker and it was a disaster. So, those are fun stories. You just don't always think about business stories as being interesting. But if you're going to stand out as a reporter, you want to look for those stories that nobody's covering. And nobody was covering, not as many people were covering those business stories. So that will make you stand out if you're looking for, the stories that nobody's covering. You talked about political coverage. I also never wanted to be a political reporter. To me, it's just herd. It's important, but it's also a little bit of herd journalism, and everybody's covering the same thing, running after the same story. So, I always look for the different story. And then later at The Sun, I was also an editorial writer, a columnist, and also focused on business issues. And with editorial writing, you can actually take a position and have influence that way. And then I left journalism after Alton took over The Sun because I just didn't want to be around when they destroyed the newspaper. But when I had the opportunity, to come to a startup where you could actually change things from the ground up, I thought that would be a good opportunity. And I think we might talk about this later, but one of the focuses we have is covering communities. Because to me, communities are just a microcosm of what's happening at the state level, what's happening at the city level, what's happening at the national level. And economics is woven through every story. And especially when you look at things through a racial lens. You can't talk about race without talking about economics, because it all starts with economics. It all starts with the Tulsa stuff that you talked about. It's all institutionalized. So economics is woven through all of those stories. So if you have that expertise, it's just going to make you stand out as a reporter.
Awesome, and that certainly tees up. We'll talk about pretty soon here about the role of nonprofit journalism in particular with economic reporting. So thank you very much. Just wonderful, wonderful stories about how you came to your current positions of leadership and influence. So let's talk about some of your work. I think that just some amazing stories that you've worked on. Let's start with Kimberly. So under your leadership, the Journal was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for your coverage of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. Just a wonderful series of stories about stories and graphics about what happened in Tulsa and what it meant for the black community then, and how the ripple effects affect black communities now. First of all, for those who are not familiar, especially for our students, tell us what the Tulsa Massacre was, what happened, who was involved, and what was the immediate aftermath.
So, this one? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So in 1921, it all started with, you have to remember Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time. They had discovered oil there. There were a lot of white people had rushed to, get in on the oil, and black people too. And black people were in this segregated area of town called Greenwood. And, very, very much kind of Jim Crow era sort of situation. A black man was arrested for supposedly, and no one truly knows what happened in this elevator, stepping on a young white woman's foot, or pushing her, or doing something to her. The history goes, well, when the door was open, she was screaming, and 1921, black man, young white woman, chaos ensues. So the people in downtown Tulsa, dragged this, his last name is Rowan, they drag him out, they put him in jail, And the people of Greenwood find out and they say, we don't want the white Tulsans to lynch this man. So we're going to go down there and stand visual outside and make sure they don't do something untowards to this man. So Greenwood was its own sort of thriving, segregated community in many ways. And people were World War I vets had come back. So they go down there and again, chaos ensues. And so then there's a lot of lore in this. So then they kind of go back and then they come back and then there's someone hits someone, shoots someone, and the white mob chases the black people back to Greenwood. So the black people get back to Greenwood and they're like, well, this is not good. And the white mobs then decide, we're going to go in and torch this town. Like there must have been all of this angst building up for a variety of reasons. So they come back, they kind of organize in some way, and these white mobs come back and just burn down 32 blocks of Greenwood. And they burn down doctors' offices, they burn down movie theaters, houses, everything. And so the ground is sort of reduced to rubble. And if there's no photo there of the cover. So there's this prominent doctor who trained with the Mayo brothers, who founded the Mayo Clinic. They pull him out of his home and they shoot him. People have to flee and all of this. So all of this chaos ensues. There are reports that the police of Tulsa deputize white mobs and say, oh, you're now police folks and you can do whatever you want. So this continues for a good 24 hours. People are fleeing, people are getting killed, all of this stuff. And then the theory is that there were planes bombarding the area from the top, from the air. Tracy, feel free to jump in if I'm wrong about any of this. So it's a mess, it's a disaster. People are killed, obviously, and the white mobs, I guess, dissipate. The Red Cross has to come in, literally living in internment camps in the town. And so then that's the massacre. And so then what happens? And so very often we talk about these things that happen in America, these race-related incidents in America as a singular event. And when we started looking into this and why we ended up doing the project, the question was, well, what was this neighborhood like before? And then what happened afterward? Because if you go to Tulsa and you go to the Greenwood area today, well, there's a lot of gentrification, but there's sort of nothing there. If you take the old map and take a new map and you drive around, there's not much there. So it kind of begs the question, and there's a highway through the neighborhood too. So it kind of begs this question, before and after, and how do you get from the before to the after? And so the massacre for us at the Journal was a singular event, and we decided not to focus on the massacre because we knew that the centennial was coming up and everyone was going to write a story about this terrible massacre. So then that left us with, well, what's the business story? The area was deemed Black Wall Street. There's a lot of myth about that. They didn't call it Black Wall Street. Someone wrote that years later in a book. So we just began doing a lot of research, and it wasn't my idea. I won't take credit for the idea. A reporter had the idea, a couple of reporters had the idea, and we started meeting a bit secretly, just on our own, a bunch of black and brown reporters in the newsroom, and decided what can we do and what can we say from a business perspective about this. And so we started reading and pulling records and trying to figure out what kind of records we could get. And this is where sort of the data and the understanding of kind of how business works and economics work really comes into play. So what we learned, for instance, was that there were rich and poor people in Greenwood. Not everyone was rich, just like any community anywhere. But a lot of people who owned businesses actually had insurance policies. They had homeowners insurance, they had business insurance, and so they burned down this woman's movie theater, and she had insurance, and she filed a claim, and guess what? The insurance company didn't pay her. So there were hundreds of these kinds of claims, and we were able to find those records. And so you kind of get to the point where you say, okay, well, 1921, slavery had ended, not that long ago. And so here's this community. These people had businesses. They had insurance claims that they were paying. So what were things like? And if you, in Tulsa, and even where the Black community's been pushed to North Tulsa, to actually quote a woman of the person who survived as a child through the massacre, she says, "My neighborhood is a ghetto now." So how do you get from 1921, people having insurance claims and thriving businesses and several chains and things like that, to the woman who was a child saying it's a ghetto? That's completely a business story. There's nothing but piece by piece economically what happened. And when we talk about home ownership and the transfer of wealth and inheriting things, the first story in our package, The Dreams of Jack and Daisy Scott, we talked to his granddaughter, and what they learned is that Jack Scott was one of the gentlemen that went down to say, "We're not going to let you lynch this young Black man." Obviously, the white mobs come in and they burn down the town. Jack and Daisy, they've got their little kids. They live in a camp. One of their kids is born in this camp in a tent. And Jack Scott is just so traumatized, like literally traumatized by this event. And, he was a boxer. He was training people. She was an editorial cartoonist. They seemingly had a nice thing going. And he moved to Tulsa because they wanted to take advantage of this new area. He was so traumatized by the event that he became abusive to his wife and kids. He hated white people. All of these men lived in fear because there were warrants out for their arrest, and so they could have been just dragged off the street at any point in time. So there is a psychological trauma there. And so then the question is, how does that relate to business? We learned, his grandchildren learned, that he did have other land that he rebuilt. He had other land. He had land in other states. But because he was so, abusive and angry with his family, they never knew that he had this land and these deeds. So they never, when he died, they didn't know about it. They didn't find the deeds, and they lost the land. And so the biggest transfer of wealth from generation to generation is through property and land. And so if you think about, this man I think he had 3 or 4 kids, and then he had all this property, and his kids didn't receive that, and they were struggling. That's where you begin to see how everything falls through the cracks. And so it was really important for us to paint that picture, to get people from, I'm doing okay, I'm going to be a good citizen and not have this young man get lynched, to these people burn down my home and my community, my children are living in a tent, but I'm still going to try to acquire land in other states, but I'm so angry and have so much PTSD and am afraid for my life every day that I can't even talk about it. And generations later, the children are just sort of finding this information buried in things. So that is, to me, that is a prime, there's really no other way to explain injustice and institutionalized racism than following that story.
So let me ask, what were the responses to that from the readership? I mean, in general, I think when the average person thinks of the Wall Street Journal, you think of reporting about financial markets, the Dow Jones, mergers and acquisitions, various industries. That's not to say there isn't great economic justice reporting, but I don't think that's what the average person thinks about when they think of the journal. So how did people respond to your reporting?
One of the things, as the editor of the project, I explained to the reporters was, when the question we wrote on the whiteboard was, why does the wealth gap still exist today? And the answer very simply was racism, right? And so we kind of started at the end, but yet the beginning. And so my guidance to them was, yes, we know the answer. We, as a group of Black and brown journalists, know the answer to that, but other people, we intrinsically know that. And so how do you report and write about what you intrinsically know and experience day to day? That actually is very hard, and it is something that as journalists you should all think about as well. That's my advice to you, to not assume that everyone intrinsically knows the things that you know and experience. So the issue was, how do you get there, and how do you tell the readers this without making a statement? And it was really important to me that we didn't make a statement, for reparations. We've actually found a white man whose grandfather or uncle or someone was actually part of the white mob, and he's very embarrassed by this and very ashamed of his family. And he says at the end, there is no amount too much to repay these people for what members of my family and others have done. So to have a white man connected to that say at the end of a story, yes, these people deserve reparations, I, as a journalist, don't have to say it. So the response to people, I think it's really interesting. People, the Wall Street Journal, there is an average reader at times, and we wring our hands about this. And, the former editor-in-chief, Matt Murray, was he was the one true supporter and fantastic supporter of the project. And I think when you lay and this is the thing about journalism that is this is the thing that we sort of do it for. When you lay out the facts, people get them. And so the comments were, if there was ever one was to the extent of if there was ever a case for institutionalized and systemic racism, this is it. You hear people who are reading stories, who like to read stories about business, when they hear that business owners are screwed over, that kind of gets under their skin, right? That's wrong. They had insurance policies and they weren't paid out. They were screwed, and if that happened today, it would be this major. And so, yes, actually, it sucks, and it sucked then, and it would suck now, and that's why we're telling you this. So it worked. It worked in the way we had envisioned it to work, because we didn't have to overstate it. And so, the data and the facts and the numbers, you can go through real estate records and see how land changed ownership and look at deeds, and then go there and see that where this person's theater was, it's under a highway. There's literally a plaque under the highway, right? You don't have to, in some respects, you don't have to do very much. And I think people appreciate that, and our readers were able to take in this information in a new light.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. I was going to go to you next, but absolutely add to that.
Tulsa story
Yeah.
earlier than we did, and stressed me out. So
Well,
thank you.
I wanted to say how jealous I was, and
jealous
the
of your
Washington
story.
Post was of your coverage, because Ziva Branstetter was the accountability editor on the financial desk, who was from Tulsa. And one of the first things she pitched when she came was to do, this was 2 years before the centennial, the Post should invest in this huge project, and let's figure out what happened, let's map this out, figure out what happened to all those properties. And she was thinking about it from just the business perspective. I was thinking about it from the racial economic perspective of what happens, let's find those descendants of the families. And there were other people involved. Deneen Brown, who teaches here, did a lot of groundbreaking historical coverage. She was the one who, her stories helped motivate the mayor, the white mayor, Republican mayor, to dig for mass graves.
Shout out Professor Brown.
Yes. So Deneen was all over this years before the centennial, years before we knew the international media
We
horde
should
would
probably
descend.
explain the mass graves. So
Okay, go
the
ahead.
official count of people who randomly died during the mobs, where it was 32 or something like that. There were hundreds of people, obviously, and the official account was, well, we don't know where the graves are. We don't see any. It was just all of this stuff, and there were mass graves, and there's work being done even now, trying to find out where these mass graves are, and to figure all of that out. Is that
Right.
right? Yeah.
So anyway, the financial desk decided that we would do one story, not a big series and project, but one story, and I would be the one to figure out a Tulsa story. And at that time, this was in 2019, I was focusing a lot of my work on reparations, different types of stories related to reparations, some very tangentially, and that was the lens through which I approached it, but I also didn't want to do a historical look back, similar to what you said, everyone's going to be writing about it. So what can I bring that's different? I was looking at currently, since there's such a huge eye on Tulsa for the centennial, there's been a lot of redevelopment in that area, in Greenwood and beyond. Let's look at the business ownership there now. So we looked at records of business records and who owns these businesses. Is this whole celebration of Black Wall Street, who owns the businesses there now? Not Black people. Black people, there's still like a little strip that there are Black-owned businesses, but it's really owned by like a corporation, like a nonprofit, not a corporation.
Development group.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then they rent it to Black business owners. But in terms of actual Black developers who own the land on which they develop property, there are none except for that one little strip. There are renters. There are Black businesses who rent from non-Black developers. And that's problematic because, as Kimberly said, it's the land that's really valuable. And so the city recognizes the issue. They have these various incentive programs. Now they're trying to develop in North Tulsa. It's not near downtown, and it's beyond the highway that was later developed that cut through the heart of Greenwood. And so my story was really about this ethos of Black Wall Street and what it's like today and what the barriers that still exist are today against the building of Black wealth in the place. And Tulsa was not unique. That type of destruction happened in communities all across the United States around that time. And even in the rebuilding, there was systemic racism. There was a law that was passed that you had to build with a certain type of material, like fire retardant material, like bricks or something. I can't remember what the technicalities were, but it was really expensive and it was prohibitively expensive for people to rebuild to that code.
So the reason why the insurance claims were not paid out was because it was deemed a riot, and there were these riot clauses. And so, as Tracy says, like, this happened all over the country. So insurance companies put in these, like, literally they're called riot clauses, where if your business is destroyed due to a riot that maybe you started yourself, seemingly, we're not going to pay out your insurance claim. And our story kind of gets into the history of these riot clauses. And for Black Tulsans, it was really important to actually rename the massacre. So it used to be called the Tulsa Race Riot, and they took out riot and just called it a massacre because that it was. And everything has an economic or business reasoning behind it, and don't forget that. So I spent a lot of time reading through minutes of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce, like 2 days after the massacre, and the minutes talk about, they're having this conversation about, well, we really want to build a highway, and it would be really effective if we built the highway through Greenwood, right? So things are still smoldering. The local business people are talking about a highway, right? Because they would benefit from having a highway and commerce to, because it was an oil area. There's a financial reason behind everything, right? Who is making money? Who stands to gain from that? And so if you always ask that question, you find this in every local community, that is the business story. It is always, sadly, it never changes, but it is always the crux of every single business story. Call it corruption, where if you want, yes, there's corruption everywhere. But to me, that was it was fascinating. It wasn't surprising. It was depressing. The entire thing was depressing. But it's a lesson in everything has a financial reason. The Flint water crisis has to do with money.
Tracy, let me ask you a couple of questions real quick about some of the other things you've worked on, because you have a lot of really interesting stories that you've written. I want to briefly touch on two, and then I want to bring Andrea to the conversation. You wrote a really interesting piece about a Japanese-American woman whose grandparents were sent to internment camps during the Second World War. And her husband, who is the descendant of enslaved people and is directly related to Martha Washington. And it was a piece about reparations and how in 1988 Congress passed a bill to provide $20,000 to the 120,000 or so people who were interned. I think about 82,000 or so actually received these payments. But Congress has yet to provide any money in reparations for the descendants of Black Americans. What I want to know is, you mentioned in the story about how the grandparents were very reluctant to even talk to their kids about, or their grandchildren and their kids about this, about their experiences. Why do you believe they were willing to talk to a reporter about it? Like, was it difficult to earn their trust and make them feel comfortable sharing the story with you?
Yeah, extremely. So I just want to say that story was the direct result of newsrooms having representation. I was asked in 2019, there was a lot of political conversation, like it goes in cycles, about reparations again. All these Democratic contenders for president were suddenly talking about reparations without really using reparations in the technical sense. Anything was reparations. But I wanted to write about, let's look at it a different way. So I'm part of an biracial family, and I have a friend who is a photographer. She was a photographer at the Detroit Free Press, who is Blasian, but she didn't realize that. Her dad is from Richmond, civil rights activist, founded a Black newspaper in Richmond, and he died a few years ago, and on his deathbed he told her that his father was Japanese American. His father had been taken after Pearl Harbor was bombed and imprisoned and never heard from again. And so he lived his life as a Black man, married a Black woman, told my friend, she's a journalist, to find out what happened to his grandfather. Like, that's your job, your mission for the rest of your life. So she did, and she found out what happened to him. And anyway, through her quest, she went to a bunch of different pilgrimages to the various internment camps where Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II. And when I was trying to think about how I would write about reparations, I wanted to write about it through an interracial family. I knew Blasian families existed, so I wanted to write about a family whose Black side obviously did not receive reparations, but whose Japanese American side were descendants of people imprisoned during World War II who did. And Regina connected me to this one particular family, the Syphax family. They're a huge family. They're all over the country, but they're from the DC area. They were written about in books on the Black bourgeois. And the Syphax family were descendants of, let me see if I can get this right, George and Martha Washington. Martha Washington had a previous marriage before she married George Washington. And one of her grandson had impregnated a woman that he had enslaved. And she later was freed. And they also have a connection to General Lee, by the way. Yeah. It's really crazy family. But she later was freed and given, before the Civil War ended, and given a 17-acre triangular plot of land that's now part of Arlington Cemetery. But her husband was also enslaved, was never freed, but they were allowed to live on that 17 acres of land that through various iterations, like the government tried to take that away from them. There was a whole act of Congress that said they could keep the land. But because they were given that land, some of their descendants believed, that they considered that their reparations, some of them, and that land was able to seed their family wealth. People in that family were able to get college educations. They became professors, doctors, government, huge government officials, way before Black people were even given the right to vote. And so that family, this branch in Sacramento, there is a woman who is Japanese American. Her grandparents were imprisoned. Her parents, were imprisoned during World War II. And so my friend Regina connected me to her. and she was very gregarious. In fact, the hardest person, so she's very gregarious, but she's like, my parents aren't going to talk to you. I can represent them. I'm thinking, like, there's no way I can tell a story about reparations and not actually talk to the people who received reparations. Right. So I spoke with her on the phone for many days and hours. Eventually, she was able to connect me with her father, who's Mitz Yamamoto, and he spoke with me on the phone, and I just felt like he wanted to tell a story, but this is not a story he even tells his grandkids, because it's so painful. A lot of Japanese Americans at the time just do not talk about it. Right. And his daughter, who's in her 50s, said, "Oh, well, you know what's crazy is my husband." I didn't know when I called her who her husband was or what his family situation was like. So she said, "My husband is actually a descendant of the Syphax," and she sent me some Smithsonian article about the Syphax family, and I was like, holy shit, are you serious? Wow. Like, yeah. Your black husband actually got reparations and your Japanese parents did also, and what does this mean? And right. Anyway, the hardest person to get to talk to me was actually her husband. He's like extremely shy and just very conservative and just does not want to be the center of attention. Yeah. But his brother is like the opposite, like very gregarious. He's the one that actually keeps all the family history. He's involved in real estate development. He very much is grounded in the history and the economics of black wealth transfer. So anyway, I flew out to Sacramento, and the family was still kind of skeptical. I remember when I landed, I texted her, and she's like, "So how long is this conversation going to be? Like, we have to be somewhere. Can we talk for half an hour?" And I was thinking, I did not fly across the country to talk to you for half an hour. But anyway, I said, sure, I'll whatever, however time you have.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to jump in and get Andrea here before you run out of time here.
Sorry.
But that's awesome. It's awesome color. I mean, we could talk about this like for hours, because I lots of very interesting articles that Tracy has written. I urge you strongly. There was a great article about Houston, the neighborhood where George Floyd grew up, that you wrote. Man, some great stuff. Andrea, though, want to make sure that you get your moment in the sun, because there's some cool things going on in Baltimore. The mission of the Baltimore Banner says that it aspires to be an indispensable resource that strengthens, unites, and inspires our Baltimore community. We will accomplish this through trustworthy, quality journalism that tells the varied stories of our people. So how does business and economic reporting, economic justice reporting, fit into the mission of the Banner? And talk a little bit more about this focus on covering communities through that lens.
Right. Let's try this again. So one of the things we talked about when we were talking about coverage at the Baltimore Banner is we wanted to cover communities that traditionally haven't been covered, or that haven't been covered, enough in the past. And we never thought about it from an economic lens, but as I mentioned before, economics impacts everything. So the economics creeps into just about every story we do. The biggest way is that black communities in Baltimore have been largely underinvested. There hasn't been investment in the communities. Even now, when you see development in Baltimore, it's in all the white neighborhoods. There's a scholar in Baltimore, Lawrence Brown. He was at Morgan State University. I forget where he is now, but he wrote a book called The Black Butterfly. And what it is the black neighborhoods form this like butterfly formation when you look on a map, and the white neighborhoods form a white L. And if you look at the black butterfly, not a lot of investment, high health disparities, and all of those issues creep into every story that we cover. We specifically hired neighborhood reporters to focus on communities, because I know I keep saying this, but communities are just a microcosm of what's happening in the larger society, and it's where it all starts, is at the community level. And I think about some of the stories. I think so. Yeah. Okay. That we wrote. I wrote a couple of them down. That didn't really start as business stories, but they are essentially business stories. We wrote about one woman whose food stamps were stolen, and you don't get reimbursed for those food stamps when you report it. So a woman, you need these food stamps, they're stolen, and then you can't eat. You depend on these to eat. And that story there was some legislation introduced nationally, where you can get reimbursed. One of the big stories we did recently was tax sales, how the law in Baltimore makes it very, very, very easy to take people's houses through tax sale. You can owe a couple $100s in taxes and get your house stolen. And guess who gets their house taken the most? African Americans, and largely elderly African Americans. And so that's an economic story. When you have a city with those large poverty rates, it's an economic story at the end of the day. There was a story we did about black neighborhoods and how banks haven't opened in black neighborhoods in years. A neighborhood near where I live, they just opened, I think, a Citibank. The neighborhood hadn't seen a new bank in like 50 years. We used great data reporters from the University of Maryland J School, by the way, that we hired, that actually mapped out where banks have located over the last 50 years. And it's always been in black neighborhoods. Another story we did was looking at grocery deserts in Baltimore. And comparing grocery prices. And what we found out is a corner store in Baltimore has higher prices than Whole Foods. Right. Who can afford that? Yes. Another economic story. Yes. Yeah. So this corner store, had higher prices than that. And then when you look at the population decline in Baltimore, there's a huge population decline in Baltimore. And some of what we're finding out is that it's African Americans leaving because they're in neighborhoods that are invested in. They're basically like, why should I stay in a neighborhood where there's no investment, when I can go elsewhere? So I would just say, so economic injustice is a string in like every story, particularly when you're looking at cities of large African American populations and higher poverty rates.
Is there, I know we're going to come up to the end of our panel soon, but I wanted to have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If any of our students or other distinguished guests have questions for our panelists, now's the time. Yes.
Hi, thank you, first of all, so much. There's a lot of crazy. But I'm curious, you mentioned before, Kimberly, about some of the correlations between like psychological trauma and the economic impact. What are some other really crazy correlations that all of you have seen when it comes to something involving economics?
Psychological trauma and impact. That's an interesting question. Yeah. Did you want to take that?
I think that was the gentleman who wrote that story. He actually has been working on a book about trauma in the black community and how there's so much trauma that it could actually be genetic, and we're passing this through generations. So I'm excited for his work to come out. I think, one of it's not really a correlation. What we did learn is that, after the massacre, that the Tulsans actually rebuilt their neighborhood, and no one talks about that. Again, the through lines are black people, poverty, destruction, white mobs, burning things down. But a little bit more reading, they rebuilt their neighborhood. There are actually more businesses in the Greenwood neighborhood 10 years after the massacre. And 1950, I believe, black home ownership in the city of Tulsa was actually higher than white home ownership. So it's not today. So then again, what happened? And, again, well, you can't burn down the neighborhood a second time. So let's find some more insidious ways through eminent domain, these tax laws, covenants, all of these different things. You start connecting, the dots are there, and that's what journalism is, like connecting those dots to say, well, why is it this situation today? Why in so many communities do property taxes influence how much funding per pupil goes to a public school? So I'm always looking at, well, why did that happen? It's not just because that people like to say, oh, well, people are late, all of these tropes. That's not the reason at all. There are forces behind that, and through business journalism, you can work through what those forces are.
Tracy and Andrea, did you want to add to that?
Yes, really quickly, I would say policing, and also, so I was working on a story about people leaving prison and the economic barriers that are up against them, that they're up against. And a lot of people go to prison for drug crimes, but in what neighborhoods? Where is the policing happening, and for what types of drug crimes? But a lot of drug crimes are also connected to violent crimes, right? Like, it's not, people think the second chance law that, oh, it's drug crimes, but people, there's assault. People have violent crimes associated with, because they're addicted. So that's a medical issue. But there's some of the economic barriers that we found were on licensing, occupational licensing. So if you have a criminal record, you're not allowed in many states to have certain types of occupational licenses, even becoming a barber in some states. That's overstated, the amount of that is, but like there's one guy focused on, because of his drug history, he would be the perfect, and he's sober now, he would be the perfect drug and alcohol counselor. You need a license for that. And in Rhode Island, you weren't able to if you have a criminal record. And so that's a cap on his income. He can't get beyond a certain level if he can't get that license.
Andrea, did you want to jump in there?
And all that starts with poverty. Why are people selling drugs? Why are people, so it's all back to economics. But just the whole legacy wealth thing, when you talk about the tropes, if your house is undervalued, if you don't have the house from your family, that gives you that wealth, that always puts you a step behind. I mean, you hear about, I remember a colleague once saying his family gave him $100,000 to buy a house. That always gives you a leg up. So that legacy wealth matters. And it makes it harder for each generation, for a generation of people to achieve and do well economically.
So I don't want to be the radio show host who talks into his hard outro. So as we come up along 11 o'clock here, I want to say thank you so much, Kimberly, Johnson, Tracy, Jen, Andrea McDaniels.